Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I'm going to talk about another new design for an old map, and the disaster about this presentation is I was rather hoping I'd be talking about an award-winning map, but it wasn't to be. So I thought about changing the presentation completely, but... Pardon? Oh, come on, Jim. Okay, so another new design for an old map, and it's actually a presentation by myself and also Professor William Cartwright from RMIT in Melbourne. So let's kick it off. As some of you might know, I have a very unhealthy fetish with a certain tube map, the London Underground map. Now, I'm not going to take my shirt off, it's really not appropriate. But, you know, to the extent of which I very stupidly a few years ago decided to go and visit a tattoo artist, and we could talk about how I reprojected the landscape tube map onto a portrait arm. We could talk about that for hours, but I'm not going to. What I'd rather talk about is something that Bill and I have been going on about for at least the last decade. We've written and presented extensively on our view, it's a view, that while Beck's ideas for the original London Underground have become the model for many transit networks around the world, we perhaps think it's time that the Beck model and the ideas behind it suffer from misuse, abuse and parody, and perhaps no longer serve the needs of the London network. To the extent that a couple of years ago I started cataloguing all of these so-called maps, diagrams, no, that was last year's debate, and put them on a tube map. So you can find this if you want. It's a tube map of tube maps parody map. And that little pop-up actually is a recursive loop because it's a pop-up that takes you back to this same map. So there's all sorts of nonsense going on in here. So we see a lot of these kind of maps where the London Underground network is taken and used in very, very different ways. And we decided to be real academics and write a proper paper about this, which was published in the Cartographic Journal in 2014, which was intentionally provocative. And we wanted to explicitly state that we felt the time was ripe for something to change. Really, we're playing devil's advocate in the paper, and it was an attempt to promote debate about the legacy of Beck's work from 1933. And we ended with this statement. I'm not going to read it out, but in conclusion, we summed up what our critique was of the current use, misuse and parody of Beck's map. And we wanted to call for a fresh start, something of a reset. You know, how would people go about making the map of the London Underground in, well, as it was then, 2014, rather than simply trying to, rehash Beck's ideas. And so just as a reminder, because every single BCS conference has to have a picture of the London Underground map in, that's what it looks like. This is a design classic. I think we might reasonably all agree with that. It may be a practical outcome as much as perhaps an unintentional but brilliant design statement where everything seemed to come together at the right time for Beck's ideas to morph into something that became the London Underground map. You all know the characteristics that make this a design classic: the omission of detail, distortion of scale, schematicized, color-coded, horizontal, vertical, 45-degree lines, exaggeration of the central, etc., etc., etc. And this is the 2019 version, and it's still very similar. It shows the massively increased network of interlinked services, but it still retains the same basic principles that Beck brought to the map back in 1933. And in our view, it's lost its way. It's full of clutter. There's a lot on there that I don't think needs to be on there. There's a lot of information there that could be better presented in a list and not necessarily on this very small fold-out map. So in summary, it was about time somebody tried to break with some of this tradition and see what could be done. And in the best academic tradition, you usually end the paper calling for this change and then somebody else goes off and does it, right? And that's great, except no one did. So I thought, well, I better have a go. And the idea was simple. I'm going to start from scratch, be unencumbered by Beck's work as far as possible. It's very difficult to get that ingrained image out of your head. And I played around with this data for a number of years, and I kind of settled on this for a while. where I was combining the idea of a schematic with hexagons, and cartographers and data visualizers all love hexagons, right? So let's morph the map into something like that. But it didn't work. We probably would agree that looks crap. So I'm not going to talk about that. I just didn't like it. And if aesthetically you don't like what you're experimenting with, it's probably for good reason. So how do you go about remaking the map? You go down to the hardware store and you buy a giant piece of wood. This was a piece of wood about 1.5 meters by 1 meter, and you bang 800 nails into it at 3 centimeter intervals to create a grid of nails. I love the faces. Where's he going with this? This was my scaffold, okay? Beck had a piece of paper and a pen. I knew with an increasingly complex network that was going to get very messy very quickly if I was trying to redesign from scratch. So how did I go about doing this? I went next door to the haberdashery and I bought a lot of thread of very specific colours, and I then decided to make my tube map from scratch by physically weaving the thread through this set of nails. I started with the central line as an anchor. I put the northern line on. Interestingly, when you're working with a geographical version of the map next to you for context, you realise that the northern line doesn't actually go north, it goes northwest. The map lied to us, who knew? So I wanted to actually move the northern line a little bit more northwest. It actually goes parallel to all intents and purposes with the Jubilee line. And the beauty of this approach is you can unravel the thread when you need to just reconfigure something locally to give it a bit more space, or to deal with Liverpool Street, what a mess, and to reorganise the thread. So you kind of start making a bit of a mess, and this gives an indication of something I also wanted to do, which was to give a better configuration between the relationship of below ground and above ground. Beck was very good at saying nobody needs to know what's above ground. I would contend that you do, because if you arrive at Waterloo and you want to go between the London Eye and Lord's Cricket Ground, what stations do you use? You don't necessarily know what the stations are. So I wanted to give space to some above ground context, and the reason for that will be clear in a moment. And after about 30 hours, I ended up with this. And this was my map. I probably should have left it there, but what I did was basically create a graphical scaffold in the software I'm employed to use. So that's ArcGIS Pro, and I basically then digitized, good old manual digitizing with my slightly arthritic old digitizing puck finger, and built a digital pegboard and traced my map and came up with something that looked like that. There was plenty of offsetting of lines to try to give it some more space, but that's essentially a digital version of what I came up with. And what did I find? Well, there's significantly fewer changes of line direction compared to the official map. There's a similar density of line work, but there's also new shapes emerging. There's a strong central diamond instead of the traditional flask we see. And I kind of got really excited about that, because diamonds were on Beck's very first original map as a station symbol. I kind of like that little homage to the history of the original map. It's still intrinsically diagrammatic. Let's take a look at some of the design choices. So I've retained horizontal, vertical and 45-degree lines. It works for the London network. It doesn't work for every network, but that square grid does work. I kept the colours because they're corporate colours, and the font. I kept the Johnson typeface. So there's a link there. But I omitted altogether river services, accessibility detail, limited services and fare zones. They can appear on other maps or other lists. The line symbols are now cased. There's a new British Rail symbol, because who remembers even what the British Rail symbol, when it changed, I guess, when national rail services were prioritised. And how do foreign tourists know what they're looking for if you give them that British Rail symbol? Doesn't make sense to me. There's a lot of negative space on this map now, as opposed to just heavy black cased ink, which I think has probably had its day. Interchange symbols follow the basic structure. There's no ticks anymore. So the stations are within the lines rather than extra ink on the page. That gives more space for text and other objects in between. Here's an element around Earl's Court. Shows the folding in of lines at the ends of terminus stations, I guess, and also the introduction of a couple of little footsteps, because that seems to me a better way of showing people that they ought to walk than, you know, another line, which seems to suggest that might be another train. Who knows? So there's just a couple of examples. The central line is now much more straight. You compare that to the official version on the bottom right, and you can see, you know, the differences begin to emerge graphically with where the lines are, and they're better geographically positioned. I would contend that my main line interchanges are a little more streamlined. Paddington on the above example on my effort, and the current, I don't know what you'd describe it, absolute mess on the official map. It's just really complicated and convoluted, and you know, it's difficult to know that you get off on one line and how to get to another line on the official map. And then we can perhaps take the most complicated area of the whole network around bank and monument, the official one below and my attempt above. And I would argue that it's a bit cleaner, and the bank monument travelator indicated by a small grey line, a simple connector for a very complex interchange. So I think what I'm trying to do here is to basically say we can create a more elegant map, has a slightly nicer design aesthetic than these clunky black cased symbols that we are so familiar with. And you end up with this, which is not the map that's downstairs, but I'll explain why in a moment. So there's one more map I wanted to make of this data. Remember I said I wanted to create space above the ground. The basic form of this map takes a traditional planimetric form, but I wanted to do something else with it. And I wanted to try to take a hint from some of these beautiful maps that I'll quite often see on the London Underground from time to time, and this is particularly on the Piccadilly Line. It's actually a graphic made by a firm called Global Vision Mapping in 1995. The original was 8 foot tall, but it came down to sort of poster size, and you saw it in the carriages. But I like this idea of being able to see the above ground and to have that context of where does the line go, what landmarks does it pass, and where are the stations that I need to get off along this route. You know, where does the Piccadilly Line go near Hyde Park, for instance? We'll just show a small sort of inset of that map, and you can start to begin to see some of the relationship between not just the below ground and the above ground. So you've got this data in your GIS, I mean, and then that's what it actually looks like. Isn't really very helpful, is it? I basically just tilted it. So you get all the problems of 3D. You've got foreshortening with Heathrow in the foreground being very prominent, and if you want to go anywhere on the central line in the northeast, you haven't got a hope of looking at even at the labels. I also like to try to create cartographic mashups and take hints from one map style and then say, well, can we use some of that in another map? And this is one of my favourite maps, the Herman Bowman Map from 1962 of New York City. And this is very famous as an axonometric projection where scale is equivalent across the entire map. It's a very particular form of the parallel projection. So how does my map look in a parallel projection? It looks like that, which actually ends up being just rotated 45 degrees, curiously. But it does give a lot of space for placing labels, which now might go along a 45-degree angle instead of horizontal, which they might follow that flow. You now might be able to put in 3D buildings or other information or contextual above ground detail. And notice that the lines on this particular example now are actually genuine tubes. So even though it's a flat map, it's a 3D product because the representation has gone from a 2D line to a three-dimensional impression of a line. And you end up with a map that might look a little bit like that, to the same sort of dimensions as the original map. So there's some above ground detail here with buildings, with parks, with other contextual information. And I'm deliberately not going to show a detailed view of that, just because it's still a work in progress. As you'd appreciate, there's a lot more effort has to go into something like that than just the planimetric. Now that ordinarily would be the end of the story, but I wanted to make this map in order to take it to a conference in Vienna in, I think it was October-November last year, and I was rushed, as cartographers often are towards the end of a project. I needed to get this thing printed because I was off somewhere else, then I had to come back and pick it up and then take it to Vienna physically. So I'd never seen this printed until I got it back from our print department. And as soon as I got it back, I looked at the map and I said, oh, those words, those labels, they're way too small. Too late. You go off to the conference and there's the map, okay? Now, bear that in mind, because the map was then displayed at the conference. And when you put your work up for peer review and people look at it, they're very forceful with their opinions, as am I. So, if I give it, I've got to be able to take it. So this was one of the comments made about that map. And it wasn't particularly positive, and it was kind of followed up by another even less positive comment. There you go. Yeah, it's pretty damning. But, that's life. At the same time, I had also sent the map off to another guy I do know called Cameron Booth, who runs the Transit Maps website. If you've never been there, go and lose yourself on this site. It's fantastic. And he was a little bit more constructive with his criticism. There was a lot he liked about the map, but there was also a lot that he didn't like. And he also made the point about the small labels, and he made one or two other points about some consistency issues. And he was dead right, because I'd rushed the work for a deadline and I had made mistakes without checking. So I'm kind of backing up everything that we did yesterday about the importance of map critique. You sometimes have to have a thick skin, but it's absolutely vital. Even if you think you've done a good job, you probably haven't, and other people's eyes are going to really help to focus in on those bits that you've missed or overlooked or made a mess of, which I had. So I remade the map. This is version 2. This is the one that's downstairs. And what I changed was the lettering. It's much larger. It's 3 or 4 point larger for the smaller typeface on the map. And I've now printed it out at the size of a pocket map, and the text holds up at that size. So the size of the poster and the size of the pocket map are now in sync with one another, so the product could be used in that way. I've used colour to encode different station functions rather than either using the British Rail symbol or my own sort of weird looking little sleeper symbol that I thought was brilliant, but apparently no one else understood, so you drop it and do something else. But I just use colour. Why don't we just colour code the mainline stations one colour label with an associative symbol, and it's blue in this case, and use different colours in different ways for other stations. I've improved the consistency. I've actually corrected a few mistakes. And whilst I wasn't intending to focus on a lines first idea with the first map, as opposed to a labels first idea, if you go all the way back to the pegboard, clearly I had, in some way. I'd focused and concentrated on where I wanted my lines to go and not necessarily given enough flexibility for where my labels needed to go. So I did a few other things, and station labelling, positioning, and tweaked a lot of things. So actually the new map, version 2, looks very similar to the old map, but fundamentally different. So that's where we are with my map. To kind of summarise, it's just an example that Bill and I have tried to put together as an attempt to reframe the map, to respond to our own call in the paper from several years ago, and think about how you might start with basically a sketch, albeit it was a physical model with wood and nails, and use that as a drafting technique to come up with a different design. That said, clearly any solution that seeks to create a diagrammatic version of a transport network, where there's a very famous map that already shows that network, is going to reflect a lineage that goes back to the previous maps. But I would suggest that this is perhaps a little more usable than some of the other types of maps that we have seen recreated of the London Underground, such as weird, huge curvature maps, concentric circle maps, all sorts of other bizarre approaches to try to create something. So we tried to tackle this from a practical problem, an approach, rather than simply an artistic, let's do something for the heck of it approach. So with that in mind, we sort of left the end of the presentation of the map in Vienna, and also here with the famous Beck quote from the front of the map. So I would be delighted for you to completely destroy that map and rip it apart and offer me your comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ken. That was good, wasn't it? Hope you enjoyed it. Any questions for Ken?
Have you approached Transport for London at all, and if so, what has been their reaction?
More importantly, they haven't approached me. No. I've been in conversation with Transport for London over a number of years for different things, and I've never found them particularly open to suggestion that their map could be changed. It's as diplomatic as I want to be.
They don't see anything wrong with what they've got. Yes, Steve?
Ken, you've obviously spent a lot of hours on that. Can I ask you what your employer has to gain from that? Is it used in your as a case study, for instance, in MOOC teaching?
Right, so part of my job is to demonstrate what the software can do. And from a purely technical point of view, there's a lot of things in there that you can look at a blog on the Esri website that details how to create schematic maps using ArcGIS Pro. That's not what I wanted to talk about here today. But if you want to know how to do it, then there's a blog there. So pretty much all the maps I make are demonstrations of software. They are built to try to break the software, to test it to destruction by creating proper maps, or proper-ish maps.
Okay, one more.
I personally don't use paper underground maps. I think maybe a lot of people have the London app, which obviously has James Hunt as useful. Given that you might not get any traction officially, do you think there's any traction in creating an app or something that people can use, that use there first, and then say?
Yeah, that's an interesting point, and I think you're right. I actually somewhat provocatively made the statement at this Vienna conference last year that I think the print map is dead for transit maps, and it didn't go down that well. Partly because we received an absolutely superb presentation by, I believe it was Siemens and somebody else, who were looking at in-car maps, digital displays, real-time information that also synced to your phone. So, you know, you're walking down the stairs, you knew where the train was, you knew what door to go to, and the map updates, and all of that wonderful stuff. And of course, that completely destroys the need for any form of in-hand map. What I would say, though, is, you know, you quite often see people going into railway stations and subway stations, and the first thing they do is they walk up to the board, and they're like pointing, this is where I am, where do I need to go? So I think the big map is still useful for planning purposes, which is a different task than navigation of a route. You know, it's like, all right, generally, where am I going? And what path do I need to take?
Okay, thank you very much, Ken. I think we have to stop there because we have another speaker coming up.